welcome to the Cut and the Dry special. Yes, this is not Kip Mock, this is Isaac Lopez. I'm just running the introduction here. Kip is here, don't worry. This is our second show that we're recording in one day. This will drop at a different time. But the purpose of this show is to talk about social media because we have two very different applications when it comes to social media in this very room.
Right.
That's Kip and I. And before we get into that, I do want to just explain this show. It's going to be a bit more relaxed, a bit more conversational than normal. I'm going to talk more, which is abnormal, and we try to avoid that to the best of our abilities. But this is also blind. I have not seen the things that Kip has prepared.
Which is pretty much nothing.
Well, because I tossed this idea at you earlier this week, and like we talked about in the previous show that dropped on Tuesday, we didn't really have a lot of time this week. So,
right. Yes.
So there's that. And I've prepared some questions for Kip and for us to kick around that he has not seen. So this is going to be as genuine of a conversation as we can get on a pre-recorded podcast. So you may hear some jump cuts because we'll probably say some dumb things along the way that we just don't want on the air. So
some of you may not know that for the Cut and the Dry, pretty much every single one of our episodes is one take, 0 cuts.
Right.
And so that's why Isaac's saying they're going to be jump cuts, because we probably are going to have to edit out some ums and pauses. But yeah.
Yeah.
Usually it's just one take, but we're probably not going to be able to that.
It's very easy to edit for the show. And just to plug that before we go on, this would be kind of a similar format to what we do with a live show on the Discord channel. So we've linked to that in the previous show. We'll link it to this to our platform there in this show. Awesome. So you guys can jump in and we can talk with you guys about anything and everything. I mean, we really just want to interact with those who are following the podcast, because if you are engaging with us, we want to be engaging with you.
Yeah.
So that all being said, I would like to kick off with a question for you, Kip.
All right.
And this is following on the heels of our Thanksgiving special that we put out with Aiden Anderson. And I think there's some really interesting things that we'll kick around from that. But Aiden and I are both on social media a lot. I joined Gab, MeWe, and Parler as you left Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, I think. But you left multiple social media accounts. Mm-hmm. And I just want to open up and ask, what were your reasons behind that? Yeah. And what encouraged you to step off those platforms?
Yeah. Okay. So Instagram I haven't had for a few years.
Okay.
Just because I didn't really have any reason to have it. Didn't really care about it. So I just deleted my account.
Okay.
I still have access to a few different business logins that I use to look at my wife's Instagram, but I usually see those pictures anyway.
Right.
So
right.
I have pretty much no use for Instagram. That's the only reason I left there.
Okay.
Twitter, I do still have an account just because every once in a while I like going and looking at Elon Musk's tweets. It's a fun time.
Fair enough.
But yeah, Facebook was the social platform that I used the most.
Okay.
Yes. And I'll try to keep this brief, but I'll give you a quick narrative of kind of the decision-making process that got me to deleting Facebook.
And also, can I interject here?
Yeah.
Because this is kind of like, it is more casual, so I can share this part of the story of the creation of this podcast.
Yeah.
Because you reached out to me midsummer.
Okay.
And asked me what podcasting platform I use to put my podcast out there. And you talked about starting a podcast, and I could not wait. But then you also mentioned that you weren't certain yet, and this was just a text exchange. Like we didn't even sit down to talk about it. And you decided to go a different route, which I'm sure we'll probably get to in that. But it's just interesting that we've come back to podcasting, and we're both doing it together, which is I think even better. But
yeah, I had actually forgotten about that, but you're right. Yes, I talked to you about Anchor and kind of all those things, and I had been thinking about starting a podcast for over a year, and just never pulled the trigger because I am bad at executing on my ideas sometimes. And so at the time, I kind of came to the conclusion that, hey, I have Facebook. I ought to use it as a publication platform because I can do that without a whole bunch of prep, without any microphones or time to sit down and edit audio. So for a few months there, 3 or 4 months, I pretty heavily used Facebook as a publication platform for things that came to mind in books I was reading, Bible passages I was reading, podcasts I was listening to. I would just say, you know what, that kind of hits hard. I think that's a good thing that I should post on Facebook. And it did get a little bit out of control several times. And the reason I decided to end kind of my Facebook rampage, if you want to call it that, is because it was causing a bit of pressure on Karis, and I'm not willing for that to happen.
Yeah, totally.
I probably had to block 10 or 20 people, and I probably had 100 to 200 people unfriend me because of the things that I was saying. And there were a few interactions where my mother was being insulted in really disturbing ways. My father-in-law was being insulted, sworn at, and he came in and jumped into my defense. It was a really kind thing, really kind comment that he had to say. But there were some threads that were, 300, 500 comments long.
I've seen those. I had some good bags of popcorn ready for those moments, but I witnessed those.
Yeah, they were, in a sense, I think it was good. I'm glad I did it. But my main purpose in it was to use Facebook as a publication platform. And what I realized through that time is Facebook is not a publication platform. This is the primary reason why I got rid of it. Facebook is a consumption platform. It's designed for people to scroll through for hours and hours, see as many ads as possible. Facebook is a business. You can't blame this for this, right?
No, not at all.
They need to make money, and they do make money because people are addicted to that dopamine hit of people liking their posts, commenting on their posts, sending them a message, whatever it may be. That dopamine hit is very powerful. We might talk about this later on. And to the point where, I fell victim to this, just like everybody else does. I would spend 30 minutes, an hour scrolling through Facebook, consuming nothing of value.
Totally.
And I wasn't using it as the publication platform that I had set out to use it for. And in the sense that I was reaching a lot of people who just hated me. And that's fine. Like, I'm totally okay with that. But I don't really want it to interfere with my home and family life, my immediate family, extended family. And it got a little bit too much. So I stopped kind of my rampage. And then I came to the conclusion that, you know what, especially after the whole election thing happened, and you're seeing notices on every single post about Joe Biden is the projected winner of this election. Election officials follow strict rules to prevent voter fraud on every single post that references the election. And I was just so sick and tired of the narrative being controlled to the point where anything I have to say is just going to be swallowed up in the void. There's no point in me saying anything on Facebook. And if it's no longer an effective publication platform for me, then I don't care about it. The only thing that was holding me back, this is actually legitimately true. The only thing that was holding me back from deleting Facebook is Facebook Marketplace. Because I buy and sell a lot of cars.
Totally.
Pretty much every other month, I pick up a new car, sell whatever I'm driving. And it used to be more often, but I use Facebook Marketplace for that because it really is great for that. And eventually I just came to the conclusion that, you know what, all of this junk does not outweighs this one thing that I use Facebook for. And so I got rid of Facebook, and that's where I'm at. I do have a Parler account that I don't really use because it's basically Twitter. And I'm not a huge fan of Twitter. And to satiate what I think is, my valuable input in publication is done through this podcast. And so because of all that, I found no further use to have social media, and here I am.
Yeah, I think that's really cool because, I just came from, it was a couple weeks ago, but talking with Aiden, and he uses social media a lot to network, to push stuff that he's been creating and working on. And it's interesting coming and talking with you, and it was right around the same time that you were getting off social media that we had some discussions around the uses of social media. So because I don't think there's a wrong answer.
I don't think there is. No, I really don't think there is. Yeah. I mean, I used Facebook for networking. That was another primary reason that I had it.
Right.
And that was useful for the first few years that I was here in Moscow. But I've established an actual person network that I have people's cell phone numbers and emails, and I know enough people that I can ask somebody for another person's contact information and actually have meaningful individual contact with a person. That's generally much more effective than being friends with them on Facebook.
Right.
And so that whole networking aspect kind of became irrelevant to me probably about 6 to 9 months ago. Because I really have gotten settled in at least the career path I'm in. I have a network of people that I deal with regularly in my career path.
Right.
And I don't see any reason for that particularly. Right. But, Aiden, who we were talking to on our Thanksgiving special, he has a film company. That's probably something you need social media for.
Yeah.
And I say all this sitting here and we're recording a podcast.
Right.
And everybody's probably like, well, why don't you have social media for a podcast? And, well, at least for the time being, you're doing a great job of handling that. And like I said, I prefer, if we're going to have interaction, I'd prefer that it's kind of a clean interaction. That's why we have our Discord channel.
Amen.
I don't see a ton of value to having, Facebook comments that I can interact with.
Totally.
That there's not much there for me to provide value or gain value from that we can't get from our Discord channel. I think we're going to get a lot more from that.
Yeah.
So
no, I would agree, and I think that's my reason right there for hopping on all the other social media platforms is because I do want to network with a lot of people and be able to understand and maybe hopefully bridge the gap for some people.
Yeah.
So that's a very slow work in progress, but also right now pushing the podcast, being able to say, hey, we're over here and going where people are and trying to communicate with them on their platforms, right? So Parler was a huge step up. When I joined midsummer, I pushed an interview I did with Jonathan Erber over there and just said, hey, these people could probably hear this because, it was labeled early on a QAnon conspiracy theorist hidey hole, right? That's where they all went to hide.
Right.
And I joined
Jonathan about QAnon.
Right. Yeah. No. So I interviewed about QAnon, but also how Christians should interact with conspiracy theories. And that might have been an opportunity to speak the word of the Lord into a place where it could be very dark. I mean, because conspiracy theories can get into that dark area.
Right.
So that's kind of my mission is to be able and be free to communicate with as many people as possible. Facebook, though, I do understand it has become kind of a cesspool.
Yeah.
But that's my reason.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. I mentioned to you that there's one verse that I kind of want to center anything I have to say on, which is Proverbs 31:23, which says, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. This verse to me kind of directs all of my decision making when it comes to how I interact in the open market, I guess you could say. How I interact when I'm networking. You obviously have your immediate family. You don't necessarily need social media for those people. But there are people outside that circle in the church community, in the business community. How do you make your voice heard where it matters? Right. And I think there are arguments to be made on both sides for different platforms of social media for how do you make your voice heard as loudly as possible? Because as a man, that ought to be one of your goals, right? You want to be heard. You want your voice to matter in your community, in your church, in the businesses you're involved with, in everything that you do. You want what you do to matter.
Yeah.
You're here to make an impact on the world and to leave a legacy in your children and in the work that you've accomplished. And so what is the best way for your voice to be heard in the gates? What is the best way for you to be influential in your community?
Yeah.
That's what guides my decision-making process. So,
dude, that's awesome. I literally, one of the questions I had for this was, how should young men utilize social media? What are some of the pitfalls, and what are some of the strengths of using social media? I think you're kind of pushing to one, right? Like being able to amplify your voice or understand how social media can be used in your town or around your people. And one of the first principles for our show is the fact that we're trying to reach young men. Would you say singles, or just young men in general?
Probably, yeah, just young men in general. Okay. Like basically guys age 15 to 25. That's kind of the target market of the cut and the dry.
Definitely.
We're trying to speak to young men, kind of our generation, who are coming into the workforce, coming into the first years of marriage, coming into the first years of fatherhood potentially, like I am. And we want to basically just provide starting points to think about what Scripture has to say, particularly about the things that our generation is going to have to deal with. So I'm sorry, I kind of lost track of where that got
you're
from.
On it. So one of the things that our generation has to deal with is social media, right? And so how are young men, whether married, single, young fathers, how should they view social media? And or better yet, how should they utilize it? And what are some of the things do they need to be wary of coming from someone that has kind of tested the limits of social media or found out some stuff by experience, by putting yourself out there and being brutally honest? We talked about in the show we just recorded about biblical mockery. And I think you did plenty of that. Like I think there are times where it was called for. Anyway,
I think, so the post that kind of kicked off my Facebook rampage, just because, you guys can't go back and see the things I said anymore. I did download a file, I think it was like 7 gigabytes or something, of all of my Facebook, the lifetime of my Facebook account. So I can go back and find those things, because I probably will want to at some point.
Totally.
But
scrapbook it.
Unfortunately, you guys can't go back and look at what we're talking about. So I'll just give you a taster. The post that initiated my Facebook rampage was some business promoting Trans Awareness Day or something like that. And my caption to sharing this post was, 40% of these people are going to commit suicide. Maybe they should try living God's truth instead of their own truth. So we're talking about pretty harsh stuff like this. That's the kind of information I was publishing. But to get back to your question, I think it's a good one. And there are so many practical things we could say.
Right.
But I want to try to simplify this down to the bare bones. So boil it all down. And I think what you need to keep in mind as you're making, because like you said, I don't think there's a wrong answer or a right answer to the usage of social media. We've come to different conclusions, and I don't disagree with you.
Same here.
So with that in mind, there are rights and wrongs involved with the decisions that you make. And I've already admitted that I was using Facebook as they want me to, spending time scrolling through it with no purpose, with no value gained, just giving Facebook money for their ad revenue. That's like, I've admitted that I fell prey to that exact thing. So, and it's very easy to do that, but that kind of thing is what you want to avoid. You want to be purposeful in whatever usage, limited or expansive, of social media platforms that you have. So what I mean by that is, just like with any tool, it can be used for good or evil. And you need to make sure that whatever your involvement with social media is, it is profitable to you and profitable to your neighbor. And if it's not, then why use it? And so that was it, as I've explained, that was my conclusion with Facebook, is there's not enough profit, and I'm not talking about monetary profit here. There's not enough value to me and to my neighbor for me to have this social media account.
Okay.
Therefore, I shouldn't have it. There was no clear path for me to use it in a beneficial way. It was just a waste of time, and a waste of my energy, because 30 minutes a day of scrolling adds up. Right? Yeah. And the time I've saved there, I've been able to put into work, put into spending time with family, and this podcast. Here we are.
Yeah.
So all that to say is find the point at which you are providing value, and set your involvement with social media there.
Okay.
Anything less than that, don't bother.
Yeah.
Don't waste your time.
Right.
And this goes for all of life. Whatever you're doing, make it productive.
Right.
And this can sound kind of utilitarian. I'm not saying it in a utilitarian manner. I'm saying, when I'm saying profitable or valuable, I'm talking about God's kingdom.
Right.
Are you building God's kingdom in everything that you're doing? If it's not, then don't do it.
Yeah.
It's really that simple.
Yeah.
And it can be difficult to kind of sift through all of the layers.
Yeah.
And boil it down to that, but I can't give anybody advice on the practical tips.
Totally.
Because everybody's going to have a different scenario.
Yeah.
So you need to sit down and figure out where does it all boil down to? Where does it boil down to the level of, am I impacting the kingdom of God for good, or not at all, or for evil?
Right.
And,
yeah.
And if that's the case, if you're impacting the kingdom of God for good, and it outweighs the amount of time that's lost in having social media, just by proxy of having a social media account, or because you've just been spending time scrolling, find your metric, find your scales, weigh the balances, and it's going to be difficult, but that's what you need to do.
Totally. Yeah. And you were talking about it's very difficult to give practical, specific advice, to any one listener. But I'll give an example, practical tip, if you will. I made the decision to stop sharing inflammatory caption posts. Those pictures. Like we talked about this. I think you brought it up in a toilet talk tip 2 weeks ago or 2 shows ago, when you talked about don't be biblically illiterate, right? That caption or that post. What people think I mean when I say I want a biblical wife, da-da-da. It just kind of rattles off, and people don't think in context of anything.
Yeah.
Or they just take it at face value or whatever. And I actually stopped sharing multiple posts like that to my Facebook feed for one reason and one reason alone, is that I only have so much time in the day to be able to dedicate to current events, to politics, because we already started this channel. You and I podcast. I have my own podcast. I'm trying to run a news site at the same time as everything else, and these are bottom rung priorities. Out of like providing for my wife, being a good Christian's up there, work, trying to finish my degree, teaching, coaching. All of these things are happening, and then this thing's happening down here, but I still want to make it good. So I decided that I'm not going to share those posts, because the people that would comment on them would want to comment back and forth for hours on end. And it was just eating up a lot of my mental energy. Right. And I'm like, the time I'm setting aside to devote to current events is wrapped up in this organization. So I'm actually not going to be super aggressive with what I post to my personal feed. Right. Because I just don't have the time. It's like I want to communicate with the people that I love, obviously, but they can listen to my podcast and we can talk about it in person. It's much more succinct and much more fast in person than via social media. So that being said, I think that you've got to count the costs, right? You've got to be smart and diligent when it comes to that.
Right. Yeah. And I think you fleshed out a really good analysis for why I stopped making inflammatory posts.
Right.
Because here we are on this podcast, and we have a Discord channel, which requires this action step of clicking a link, creating a login, joining our channel. That's a level of investment that you don't need to comment on my public Facebook posts.
Right.
Hundreds of people that I have no idea who they are can comment and say something nasty, and potentially precipitate a response for me to try to reach out to this person, but it's not a person who has any type of investment in this relationship that's just been initiated. Whereas I can say inflammatory things on this podcast, and if somebody wants to interact with me about it, they can't do it on Facebook.
Right.
Maybe they have my number and they can text me. At that point, they've probably invested in some type of relationship.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I love that.
And so the people who I'm interacting with are by nature required to have more investment in a relationship with me through either the Discord channel, sending me an email, sending me a text, than some random person commenting on Facebook. That is zero investment, zero time. It's maybe 3 seconds to type out a nasty Facebook comment. And so it's a different level of interaction that I think hopefully will be far more valuable because I'll be talking to people on this Discord channel who actually, have some skin in the game. They at least have a little bit of care for what's going on.
Right.
So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. No, and I like that. I like the more human side of podcasting than commenting, because there's much more context and you're investing more in not only the person's thoughts, but also the way they communicate, right? When you podcast and listen to people podcast, you understand, the way they're talking here is probably much closer to the way they talk in person than what they're typing in the comments or in a post. Like it can be less focused on one particular aspect, and you get more of a universal understanding for who they are. Closer, we get a closer taste of who Kip Mock is, who Isaac Lopez is on the Cut and Dry.
And you and Aiden talked about this in your show about the internet persona that's created by having any form of social media. That just by nature of what a Facebook comment or a Facebook post is like, it's not going to represent who you are as a person, like a 30-minute or 40-minute podcast show will.
Right.
And at the same time, the type of people who are going to spend the time to listen to what you and I have to say for 30 minutes, they have to care a little bit more than the people who read a 140-character tweet.
Right.
So that is a huge thing to consider as
Definitely.
Well, hey, thanks guys for listening. We're gonna pause this episode here and continue on in a later show. Isaac's got some more questions and we've got more discussion, but we don't want to keep your time too long today. So we'll wrap it up here for the Cut and the Dry. This is Kip and Isaac signing off from this special.